this is Aikare and welcome to Rappler Talk. Joining us today is public transportation expert and advocate Robert C. to talk about the possible issues once the enhanced community quarantine is lifted. He was formerly with the Asian Development Bank and the Department of Transportation. He is now with the Move as One coalition. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Hi, Aika. Good afternoon. And thanks for having me. I have a lot to talk about.
So, sir, let's start with this. What's your sense of the transportation sector once the enhanced community quarantine is lifted?
Well, there are huge implications uh, that have come with COVID-19. And I think we already see that today. One is physical distancing. What has happened to the transport industry? Physical distancing has reduced the capacity of our transport operators uh, by a very large degree. And let me just give you an example, right? MRT3, it used to carry about 350,000 people every day, 350,000. But we have heard from DOTR that because of physical distancing, their capacity will be significantly reduced. They
Mm-hmm.
will only be able to carry maybe only something like uh, you know 45 to 50,000 passengers a day. Now, that means that we have just lost from MRT3 about 300,000 seats every day. And that is a significant loss. In addition, when you look at public transport, the rule now is you can only use up 50% of your seats
Yeah.
or less. So that immediately has hit the transportation sector in a very big way. And what we can say is many operators will not be able to be viable if they can only use 50% of their seats.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, we are going to see a lot of interest in using private motor vehicles. People
Mm-hmm.
who own a car or motorcycle will say, ayoko na sa public transport because of the risk that you will be in a crowded space. So
Mm-hmm.
they will use
I
whatever
agree.
means they have for self-isolation. That will mean more traffic on the road. And if we don't address that, public transport will have a more difficult time operating. They will be slower. So that might even lower the capacity. So the combination of more traffic plus reduced operators, reduced number of operator capacity, and the possibility that many operators will go out of business means that you will have much longer queues. You will have also uh, people who will have no option but to walk or to cycle. So there are several uh, prescriptions that we have for the government. One
Mm-hmm.
is to make walking and cycling safe. Otherwise, people will get killed. There will be more collisions affecting pedestrians and cyclists because there will be more of them on the road and they will not have protection. So we need to have protected sidewalks and protected bicycle lanes. On public transport, we need to have first assured services. We cannot have a situation where every single operator can decide whether or not they will go out. We need to have a way so that there will be public transport service for the people who will need to travel, right? Once we open up uh, after ECQ, granted, we won't have the same travel demand as before, but
Mm-hmm.
still we will have millions and millions of Filipinos
Yeah.
needing to go around by public transport. So we need to have that assurance. So maybe I can talk about that a little later, but you might have some thoughts on what I just told you.
Okay. So they were saying that the estimate is that some 30% from pre-coronavirus um, commuting demand will go out once the EZQ is lifted. So LTFRB Chairman Martin Delgado was saying earlier from the Senate hearing that that's probably around 30%, of course, will be served by those with cars, while the rest of the 70% will use public transportation. That's roughly around 2.4 million passengers. So with reduced capacity, what do you think should DOT or do to be able to service millions of Filipinos, as you said earlier?
Our advice is we need to have public transport well organized and put on a more reliable basis. And the only way we can do that under these circumstances is to contract operators so they will operate in a coordinated way and we can what we call command and control the whole fleet. If we just leave it to everyone's decision, every operator's decision whether they will go out or not, it puts, I think, the public at great risk because if you have many operators competing for maybe fewer passengers than before, you will see unmanaged queuing, you will see a lot of crowding, you will see commuters chasing for vehicles, and you will see vehicles chasing for commuters. We need to put things in an orderly basis, and one way to do that is for government to have a budget to contract public transport operators, manage them in an organized way, and then government can collect the revenue. This is how public transport is operated all over the world. In the best cities, this is how public transport is managed. And we need to look at this, the contracting of operators, not as only a subsidy. It is an investment in transforming our system from a low quality one to a higher quality one. So I think when sometimes when budget people or legislators look at the suggestion of paying operators to run a service, they think, oh, why should government pay for that? We've never done that in the past. But we are the exception. And we have paid for that with really bad, low quality public transport. We need to make that change. And we have a chance to make that change today if government can make that investment. And what I would say is, it's not just something which is for the survival of our transport industry, but it will also produce better health outcomes. If we don't do it, then we will have the risk of very high rates of virus transmission. Yes, if we don't have proper queuing, if we don't have proper sanitizing of vehicles. I think the government's expectation is, okay, you should go out there, you should collect fares, and maybe you will only have half the number of seats. But even though you might not make a profit, please spend some money to sanitize your vehicle. I think that is not a realistic proposition for the transport industry. If we just ask them to do it without giving them financial support, then it will make for a very risky situation.
So, sir, don't you think it's high time to implement the PUV modernization at this time? Because Chairman Delgra was earlier talking about route rationalization. He said that they will be issuing special permits and they will be prioritizing buses first and then
Mhm.
modern jeepneys and then jeepneys after. How do you make sense of that?
Yeah, definitely. Uh, PUV modernization makes a lot of sense, and it begins with, as Chair Delgra said, the route rationalization. So if we can achieve that, that would already be a significant, improvement. But one thing we need to realize is the PUV modernization also requires uh, vehicle upgrade. And this is something which we need to look at for the medium to long term. Today, we may achieve route rationalization. The other thing which I hope we can achieve is industry consolidation, meaning that on every route, we need to make sure that all the operators on a route work as one team. They work, actually, if they work as one team, they will be more efficient. They'll have lower operating costs. You know, they don't have to all go out at the same time, and they will serve commuters better. Uh, one way, one way government can also support that is to provide any subsidy uh, to groups that will consolidate and operate under what we call common fleet management. They have to all be working as one team. And the other concept is they all collect fares for a single revenue pot. You see, if they all work together to try to increase the size of that pot, then they will serve commuters as best they can. They won't just compete with each other on the street, but they will actually organize their services so they will maximize their ridership. So that's, I think, one of the things which we need to seek. PUV modernization is needed even more today than before COVID-19.
So, in terms of PUV modernization, apparently there's no budget for that this year.
Mhm.
So, right now, what the government is saying, at least from the Senate hearing, that they're encouraging people to basically encouraging people. So, number one is they're encouraging PUV operators to implement cashless payments. And number two, part of their policies right now is that they will not um, increase the fares. So, with the viability in question and fares that will not increase, do you think how it's going to be like for especially the small time operators in the public transportation sector?
So this is the reason, Aika, that uh, the government, if it keeps fares low, it needs to have a way of supporting our transport operators so they remain viable. And one way to do that is this mechanism which we call service contracting. Government should be able to talk to a group of, for example, jeepney operators to say, okay, this route needs 200 jeepneys. If you all work together as one team, uh, how much will you charge for per jeepney to operate per day? Government can negotiate with them so that each operator, each jeepney, has a guaranteed payment so long as they provide the service. Of course, this type of contract should be what we call performance-based, meaning if the operator does not perform or they don't go out and provide the service, government can also impose penalties. And this is how it is in many countries. So uh, we need to move to this type of setup so that we can have reliable services. But one advantage to that as well is, you see, if government has long-term contracts with operators like this, the operator can go to a bank and say, please lend me money to modernize my vehicle, right? If government has an assured payment for an operator and a long-term contract, this enables the operator to go and borrow money for fleet modernization. So in a way, it could have a dual purpose, shifting to this type of service contracting. If we do this, then the private sector, all the banks, can come in and provide financing for the transportation sector. It need not depend only on DBP and Land Bank. They don't have enough resources for the entire industry.
So do you think this should be part of the stimulus package that is now pending at the House of Representatives?
Definitely, Aika. The government cannot leave public transport out of the stimulus package. Too much is at stake. Our transport professionals have made a calculation of what would be the economic cost of uh, leaving public transport out of the stimulus package, and we see a figure of over 520 billion annually. And that's
Wow.
a combination of economic losses plus losses from additional fuel consumption, losses also from air pollution, impact on health, and also additional road crashes because of uh, poor road safety. So basically, when we look at the calculations, it's really a huge cost that the economy might suffer if we do nothing. So just from the shutdown of public transport operations in 1 year, we stand to lose about 49 billion. More difficult commutes of everyone because of the lack of public transport. It Commuting time will be much longer, as already MRT3 has announced. They have said your queue might take 3 hours, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that impact we calculate at about 224 billion annually. And then you will have job loss. There is a segment of our workforce that will lose their jobs simply because they will not be able to get to work. And there the annual loss would be about 157 billion. So just the economic cost we estimate as about 430 billion, and then there's an additional 93 billion from fuel cost, pollution, and collisions. So this is something that we cannot ignore. It cannot just be, transport operators, please tighten your belts and keep serving the industry.
Do you think, or maybe do you have a computation for the amount of bailout, perhaps, that the operators should be allocated
Yes,
for?
we are advocating a budget of 110 billion, and it's broken down like
Per
this.
year, per month?
Uh, well, this is some of it is short term and some of it is long term.
Okay.
So maybe I can break it down by saying
Mm-hmm.
first you have 30 billion, which we propose that the government spend on what we call service contracts. So this enables
The worker.
government to hire uh, public transport operators to provide a service. And we estimate that this could run for maybe 4 to 6 months until uh, automatic fare collection can be organized. You see, automatic fare collection cannot happen overnight. So initially, government will have to pay operators to provide the service, and maybe initially the transport services could be offered for free. And maybe this is another way of social amelioration. Essential workers can get to work and maybe not have to pay initially for public transport. Over time, government could introduce automatic fare collection, have card distribution, so everyone has a tap card. And then after 4 to 6 months, government can collect fares. And then that will help to pay for the contracts that are issued. So we could continue with this type of uh, more professionally managed services, but things would be on a more sustainable basis. So that 30 billion is really talking about a 6 month period to bridge the gap until automatic fare collection can be introduced. Now, maybe I can talk a little bit about the rest of the package. So I talked about the 30 billion. We are advocating 10 billion to be spent on infrastructure for for cycling and walking. And one reality that we will face is that many people will not be able to access public transport. There
Mm.
just won't be enough. There is not enough supply for people. Initially, the government is thinking maybe only 30% of the demand will come out. But that might be just at the start. After a
Mm.
while, we will resume 40%, 50%, 60%. And maybe we might get to a point where it's around 70%. We may not get back to pre-COVID levels, but still it will be quite high. How do we accommodate all of that? It won't be possible with our existing public transport fleet. Many people will be forced to walk or cycle. Within the 110 million package, we are advocating 10 billion to be spent on walking and cycling infrastructure. And what would be the way this would be spent? We need to have infrastructure in every urban barangay to improve the sidewalks as well as to create protected bike lanes. And one big advantage of this is it will generate a lot of local employment in every community. We can upgrade the facilities in every part of every city, but at the same time, we will generate a lot of local employment at a time when it is most needed. Actually, in our budget, we are proposing about 1,600 kilometers of uh, cycling and pedestrian infrastructure nationwide. Then we have a provision for buying bicycles. Every city should have a program where it can have bicycle sharing or bicycle lending to people who have no other means to travel except perhaps by bicycle. For some people in the community, they may not be able to afford even public transport fares, but a bicycle will give them the capacity to travel around using their own energy. And then we need to look at parking for bicycles. Every urban area needs more parking for bicycles wherever you have concentrations of people. Every place or employer, every office needs to have bicycle racks. And so we have provision on in our proposed budget that would also allow for LGUs, local government units, to procure bicycle racks and uh, disperse them in strategic locations. The last part of our proposed budget is 70 billion. And this is really to improve the efficiency of our public transport system. In order for our buses to move faster, we need to actually put them on what we call dedicated lanes. We need to
Mm.
separate buses and other public utility vehicles, separate them from the traffic with cars. Today, we see all our public transport mixed up with cars, and
Yeah.
that slows down our public transport fleet. But if we are able to create dedicated lanes and also more efficient, more comfortable bus stops, that would also be a very good facility for our commuters. We also recommend uh, building of new terminals and depots to serve our public transport sector in every city. So we need about 70 billion over a 2 to 3 year period to actually improve the quality and the efficiency of our public transport service. So it will go hand in hand with uh, what we are doing to reform the sector with service contracting.
So what do you think about the possible traffic congestion once the ECQ is lifted? So, I mean, imagine right now we see that some areas in Metro Manila have heavier volume, even if it's ECQ. So, what do you think will happen during GCQ?
Now, that's a very good question. The experience of other cities that are coming out of lockdown, including many cities in China, is that private vehicles, there are more private vehicles coming out, and people are wary of using public transport. So we need to address those two uh, actually very worrisome trends. We need to find ways of managing the additional traffic that will be coming, as well as making public transport more attractive by uh, making public transport operate more efficiently, but also reassuring our public that all sanitary measures are being applied. You know, Secretary Tugade was, I think, very good in uh, explaining yesterday how the trains are going to be sanitized. We need to have that kind of also assurance with
For other
our other buses and jeepneys. We need to give our public the assurance that the vehicles will have proper sanitation and the distancing will actually be complied with 100%. That way we can attract more people back into public transport. But one very important point is we also need for everyone in government, national and local government, to adopt the principle that we need to prioritize public transport, walking, and cycling in the use of our road space. Today, our road space is filled with cars, but the reality is only 12% of households in Metro Manila are car owners. Everyone else has to rely on public transport, walking, or cycling. We have to now prioritize the interest of the majority. Private car users already have a means of self-isolation, of protecting themselves from contact with the larger community. If it takes them more time, if they are more stuck in traffic, I think we may need to accept that as addressing the greatest good for the greatest number. We have to give more road space for people who will be walking, cycling, and using public transport. But one advantage of doing that is that we will be able to move many times more people than what we would be able to do if we just let our traffic continue as it has in the past, all mixed in and not very well organized. Uh, I believe this is a chance for us, for the government to implement what's already there in its national transport policy. I'm not saying anything which is new. This has been adopted by the government in its national transport policy that public transport, walking, and cycling should have priority over private motor vehicles. It should now show us that it has the political will
to implement.
to implement that principle. And that's what we need for the health of our citizens, for the for the in a way the resumption of economic activities, and to protect as many jobs as we can.
Okay, so we've been talking heavily about the policies and the transport sector. Maybe we can shift to the commuters.
Mhm.
What do you think? We know that there will be probably longer lines, especially at the railway stations and perhaps on the streets because um, there will be less or the frequency of public utility vehicles will be less. What do you think should the commuters do? Should they adapt or should they demand something else?
I think there's certainly two things. One is we all need to examine our past travel habits and explore the possibility of new options. And one one definite suggestion is to explore whether uh, walking or cycling, especially if your travel is not such a long distance, is viable for your situation. If more people are able to walk or cycle, it will reduce the demand on our public transport capacity. We know our public transport capacity will now be even more deficient. So the more we can offload into walking or cycling, the better. And so if you think this is an option, uh, commuters should press their local government officials as well as national government officials to do something to make that safe. We need safe corridors for walking and cycling. And one way they are doing this in many countries, and actually many cities are adopting this as their number one strategy in COVID-19 for addressing the transportation sector. They are making more and more streets what we call carless. You know, my suggestion is every every LGU should identify about 10% of its streets and make them carless. Already, we have many streets that have checkpoints and are already have some barriers. We can just continue with those barriers, allowing only people who are walking or people on bicycles to use that corridor. If you have a car, of course you can get inside and outside, but only people who are residents of that street can drive on that street and
Yeah.
maybe very slowly until they can get outside of that street. But it means that we can turn on a cycling network and a walking network in our cities without any cost. It's simply a matter of putting barriers and designating certain streets as car free. But it must be a network. It must enable people to get from end to end, to their destination. And the best solution is if we have a network within our entire metropolis. So MMDA should be coordinating this type of effort to
Yeah.
create to create a network of these car-free streets. And then I believe there are millions of Filipinos who would go and take their bicycle out of their garage or their storage and repair it, and then they'd start using a bicycle. And this would actually mean for uh, lower fuel costs, lower uh, less traffic, right? Also better health and happier citizens. I think this would mean for uh, you know a more livable city for all of us if more people cycled, and even if you know uh, if every community could have a safe corridor for walking and cycling.
Yeah, I agree. And I think Pasig City has already started leading the way. Do you think other cities should adapt the same strategy?
Definitely, it's a very low cost and very, I think, strategic approach. Uh, in Pasig's case, they used traffic cones and very low cost infrastructure in order to introduce these cycling and walking corridors. Uh, any city can do it in a week, and we still have a few days before possibly ECQ might be lifted. If every city said, okay, let's find 10% of our streets, let's create that network, we would have, uh, I think, a very good uh, setup to start with. And then we can improve the actual physical infrastructure later on. But we can actually do what we call this pop-up infrastructure for cycling and walking. It can be done very quickly at low cost.
Okay. Okay. I'm just checking what else I missed. Um, okay, last na lang po.
Mhm.
Okay. So, I think this is going to be my last question po, no? So, during the Senate hearing, apart of course from the 5,000 pesos subsidy that is given to jeepney drivers, there's another subsidy that was apparently just approved by the IATF. It's going to be a fuel subsidy worth around 8.8 billion pesos per month for buses. That's going to be like 36 liters of fuel for um, jeepneys. I think it's going to be like 12 liters. So, do you think that kind of subsidy is enough, or do you think there should be more?
Well, my reaction there, Aika, is a subsidy will help in the short term. That's for sure. It will help many transport operators uh, to survive over the next few weeks. But we need something more sustainable. And what do I mean by this? Uh, First, it would be good if the subsidy promoted consolidation. For example, government could say, we will only release the subsidy, but only if you are an organized group covering one route. So, uh, if the group of operators on a route can actually form a cooperative or an association and agree to manage their services in a common or collective way, that would be a tremendous benefit for commuters and would help to make the system more efficient. So, first, it would help to make the organization of operators more efficient. But we need also more than that. It would not be very meaningful in terms of increasing public transport capacity unless we make the operations of the vehicles more efficient. And that means we have to improve things like the infrastructure and try to move these vehicles into what we call a dedicated lane. In fact, we could also move some of these vehicles into a car-free street. We could actually design a route so that, uh, for example, a jeepney route, we could design it so that it travels only on a car-free street. Can you imagine that? If you're someone living on that street, I would love it because, I step out of my door, I have public transport there, and my street is very safe, because it's only public transport that is moving along this corridor. And maybe it would even be a very nice street to walk on. It would become a street where maybe people would like to uh, you could have outdoor seating if you had a restaurant on a street like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is like some of the imagination that we need. But so it can't just be a subsidy that's given to individual operators. We need for the subsidy to incentivize consolidation and for the subsidy to be matched by infrastructure improvement. So with that combination, it's a winning combination.
So I guess maybe I could just ask you, what's the best so far, maybe best practices that the Philippines should um, copy, adapt from other countries that came out of a lockdown.
Mhm. Well, what I can see in many countries that have come out of a lockdown, number one is they have invested a lot in walking and cycling. For example, London, the mayor of London, and even Boris Johnson has announced that walking and cycling will be their number one strategy for dealing with COVID-19 in the transport sector. I mean, that's like the Prime Minister himself coming up and saying that. Singapore has announced that they are going to, by 2023 have an additional 800 kilometers of bicycle
Like,
lanes. These countries know how severe the problem is and what they need to tackle the problem. So actually, it means changing our thinking about how people will move around the city. We have to do that now and urgently. The second is to make our buses and other public transport more efficient. Railway development is very important and very much needed. But the rail projects that we are working on today, they will only bear fruit in the next administration. The ones that come on stream uh, within the next couple of years will not make that big a difference. What we need to make a difference are with buses and jeepneys. That's what we have to focus on right now. And that's what I'm hoping DOTR will put, 100% of its attention right now. How to make buses and jeepneys move more efficiently so that the capacity can be increased. It will only be increased if buses and jeepneys have more round trips every day. They will not have more capacity if they are stuck in traffic. So we need to focus on that measure. And we are seeing many countries around the world saying, we are going to now do a lot more, invest a lot more with our buses because they can deliver faster results.
perhaps it's also a question of the bus rapid transit. It's been
Yes.
yeah, a question that's being dodged by the
Yes. Well,
Department of
you see,
Transportation.
this is I think an important point. In the past, there was a view. There was a view that we cannot put bus rapid transit on congested streets. But let me translate that for you. We cannot put bus rapid transit because it will offend car users, our very vocal car users who will complain to us tomorrow about how bad the traffic has become because of the buses, right? But there is no more time today for favoring the small minority of car owners and disadvantaging the vast majority of people who do not own any private motor vehicles. The government has to stand today for the greater good and for the greatest number. And we know that that is what President Duterte has promised. And this is the best way they can show it. Government has to say now, where we have congested roads, bus rapid transit will cater uh, for the greatest good and the greatest number. That's what we need to pursue, even though we will offend people who are car owners. Car owners today have to realize they already have their means for self-isolation and protection, uh, from COVID-19. If the rest of the population gets infected because of bad transport practices, they will also be at risk. So they have to think, how can we protect the rest of our society so that all of us heal as one, right? I think that's the thing. We need to heal as one. And that's really the message that everyone needs to internalize now. We cannot say that, oh, this bridge is only for cars. We need to think of how can we make every bridge uh, move the maximum number of people, not the maximum number of cars. On EDSA, we need to think, how can we move more people rather than vehicles? That needs to be internalized by every official in every national and local office.
Yes,
So,
Vera, thank
yeah,
you so much, sir, for
yeah,
joining us today. Yes,
yes.
I'm Ikari, and thank you for watching Rappler Talk.